There's a reference that international education is sort of the best form of grassroots diplomacy. I think that's part of the interest in mutual learning, is that we can learn about ourselves and we can learn about others.
I'm Michael Feuer, and this is EdFix, your source for insights about the practice and promise of education. Welcome to Studio T. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Jim Williams and Dr. Laura Engel, who are both faculty members in our International Education program here at the George Washington University Graduate School of Education and Human Development. Jim Williams is a professor. He chairs the GW UNESCO Chair in International Education for Development. Jim's research covers issues regarding policies to improve education in low and middle income countries, the effects of education on conflict and social cohesion, and predictors of socioeconomic gradients. Laura Engel is also a member of the faculty in international education, co-chairs the GW UNESCO Chair with Jim, and her work, which is funded by the National Geographic Society and other sources, focuses on such matters as the impacts of our DC Public School Study Abroad program, and Laura is also doing very interesting work on issues related to international comparisons of education. So, welcome to EdFix. What are we preparing our students to be able to do when they come out with a degree that says education with a specialization in international education?
Certainly. Well, thank you for having us. International and comparative education is about the cross-cultural exchange of ideas, of individuals. It is a focus on insights that we can get from comparing educational planning, policy, and practice across systems. It is the incorporation of global and cross-cultural perspectives into education. But I also think of it as, well, international education is not an armchair field. It's a field of doing. It's a field of practice. It's a field of action. So I like to think about it as what our students do with this degree. We work in international education here at GW in 3 buckets. First is international higher education, so issues of study abroad and exchange at the higher education level. International education for development, which Jim could speak more eloquently about, has to do with education planning, policy practice in low and middle income countries. And the last bucket we could call K-12 global education, has to do with internationalizing schooling systems.
I'm particularly, as Laura mentioned, I'm particularly interested in the issues of helping education systems improve, in a sense, policy kinds of issues in poor countries, and what can be done to assist, but also to share experience and build up capacity. But there are almost probably as many definitions of international education, international and comparative education, as there are international and comparative educators. There is a theoretical side to it, informed by social science disciplines and other things, but we tend to emphasize the practical.
Over the years, any kind of trends in first of all, in the attitudes of American-born, American U.S. students toward what's going on in other countries, and an interest in this quote-unquote internationalization and the expansion of their own perspectives on the world. And similarly, whether you've noticed any kind of trends in the ways in which students from other countries think of American higher education and the attractiveness of coming here and spending some time.
We get people who have had a significant international experience, high school and college, travel, gap year. Almost everyone that we get has had some international experience that changed their lives is a bit strong, but that had a heavy influence on them. And so it's hard to tell if American students in general have shifted. Certainly our group is quite idealistic, quite passionate about the various things they want to do. So that's a hard one. And we're in Washington, we're at an international university in many ways, and so it's a little difficult to see. In terms of international people, I would say the U.S. higher education system is quite, from my observations, is quite attractive, but it has lost a bit of its salvic appeal. I'm told that some students in China, while many come to the U.S., many think carefully about, they balance the career options they're likely to have, the quality of Chinese universities, of having the networks that help one get a job and such. And so those calculations are becoming more prominent, I believe, in different places. I spent a year in Southeast Asia recently on a Fulbright, and they had indicated an interest in U.S. higher education, but a certain feeling of abandonment in terms of both foreign policy and higher education. And so there was, sure, we're interested, but where are you?
I was thinking about with internationalization patterns. When you look at history of study abroad, through much of the 20th century, it was an elite practice. It was to be cultured and civilized. I'm thinking of some of the elite boarding schools in the 70s and 80s opening up study abroad, term abroad at the K-12 or secondary level. That has shifted in many respects. You think about post 9/11, internationalization was no longer an institutional opportunity, but became, in many respects, a national priority. In a sense that we needed to develop cultural global competencies, we need to accommodate for flows of people. There's more of an acceptance for hybridity, multiple experiences, multiple belongings, multiple identities. It's an interesting time to be focused on international education with all that I've just said, and yet at the same time the rise of nationalism and a thinking about some of the resistance to these global orientations. And so some have started to question whether we're at, the golden age of international education has kind of lost, I think that was the headline, has lost its sheen. So it's been debated right now.
I totally agree. And I would say that for many countries, international study, it depends on which countries. The wealthy countries tend to see international study as a finishing a complement, a development of these global competencies and that sort of thing, an enrichment. Whereas poorer countries tend to see it more, individuals and the countries themselves, as human capital formation, as a way of enhancing skills and knowledge for individual or national advancement. And so I think those are complementary. They're both important still, but China has higher ranked physics departments than the U.S. And so the U.S. preeminence is being challenged in some ways.
And there's some really interesting research on the rise of the global middle class, which is looking at international education, and that might be an IB, International Baccalaureate School, or it could be an international experience, an abroad experience, as a way to give their children a competitive edge in an increasingly globalized environment. And so there's some really interesting research around the ways in which this has facilitated or maintained a sense of elitism and the gaps of inequality that we clearly see existing in many countries.
And it makes me wonder whether part of the benefit of an international education program is that we can learn from developing countries what to do in some of our most impoverished cities and localities here. Do you find that that's something that students get interested in also?
I think there's a great interest in coming to international education for mutual learning opportunities. There's a reference that international education is sort of the best form of grassroots diplomacy. I think that's part of the interest in mutual learning, is that we can learn about ourselves and we can learn about others. So there's kind of a diplomacy element to this. So I do think that students are very open and interested to learn about themselves, their own education system, whether that's the compulsory or higher education sector, as well as other countries. There's a great openness to that.
I want to ask about the UNESCO chair.
The UNESCO chair is a designation by UNESCO,
Which stands for?
United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It was established along with the other UN systems at the end of World War II, or after the end of World War II. U.S. played a major role in establishing UNESCO, and it's the flagship organization dealing with education for the UN. UNICEF also plays a role in education, but for children, and much more narrowly focused in some sense. UNESCO has a broad mandate. The UNESCO chairs, there are probably 700 or 800 around the world in various specialties. Some are in education. We're the second in the U.S. Related to education, but there are others related to international organizations, to climate, to just all manner of subjects. Education, cultural and scientific covers quite a lot of space. And so these chairs do not bring a direct financial contribution from UNESCO. Part of that is that UNESCO is not terribly well funded, in part because the U.S. and other countries have withdrawn. But it does provide the designation, the contacts, the linkages with other chairs, a bit of a name. And so the funding is provided quite generously by the various universities that put in an application for a chair.
And we have, as part of our UNESCO chairs program, been able to send some of our students to be fellows of some sort in various locations. Say something about that.
So since the launch of the chair, we've sent cohorts of students abroad every summer to be placed in UNESCO field offices and institutes around the world. We have now we're actually just now sending the 5th cohort, who are going to really across the world, Myanmar, Thailand, Germany, France, Chile, Indonesia, and they're really working at the front lines of UNESCO and its work. They are working on issues related to gender equality, to education for sustainability and climate change education, to education for global citizenship. So a range of social and education policy issues that are being championed by UNESCO. It's very exciting.
It's very exciting. And of course, they come back and then they've had one of these conceivably transformative experiences. Mm-hmm. How long do they spend in these places?
Between
2-3 months?
3 to 6 months.
3 to 6 months, yeah. So.
And they get a chance to see what it's like to work for a multilateral organization, as well as what it's like to work in international education development within one of these multilateral organizations.
Is it still fair to say that comparisons of international educational measures of performance can be one of the most sort of compelling elements in a nation's education policy rhetoric and the politics of education?
I think yes. I think it's certainly true for some countries. I'm not sure about the United States. Maybe in the media and in rhetoric, there is a drive to use international comparisons of educational performance as a stick for reform, or as a rationale for reform. But beyond that, I'm not sure that we see if we see real critical education policy uses. Critical meaning looking at the data and producing secondary data analysis that's considered appropriate for education policy making. I think in other countries, it's very seriously considered and can shape educational reform in big ways.
Examples?
There are some systems that do not have national or local assessments. So the international assessment might play a very important role in shaping education policy.
To me, at least, the international comparisons are more useful when We did a special issue of a journal a couple of years ago on this, and one of our authors contrasted the use of international assessments as a stick, as Laura mentioned, or as a thermometer. And in my view, they're much more useful. They're probably useful to mobilize attention as a stick. And then, but soon thereafter, I would hope that it would turn to the thermometer. And the third might be something like a gold star or a grade. And it seems to me that's the least useful. It's good to mobilize public opinion and then and political action, but then looking at it as a thermometer. What's going on in other systems? How are they managing this? As opposed to we won, we lost. It's a kind of a binary that's not so very helpful.
But there is an argument to be made for a kind of policy analysis of the uses of international comparative assessment. Absolutely. And I know that's something that you've both been interested in and involved in. Didn't you just did a paper recently on the costs and benefits of something like the U.S. continuing to participate in these kinds of things? What led you to wonder about that?
Well, exactly. This question was writing a paper around education policy uses in the federal U.S., where a number of states in the 2012 Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, funded themselves to participate. So all states participate, but a small number, 3 states in 2012, paid an additional sum of money to the OECD to have results specific to the state level. And I was very interested in their motivations for participating in PISA, as well as the uses of PISA at the state level. And what I initially envisioned was a simple and straightforward question. I wonder because I knew at the state level what was being paid to the OECD, but I began to wonder, well, what does a country pay to participate? And I thought it was a very simple and straightforward question, easily answerable with a phone call to the Department of Education. And about a year and a half later, we came to write an article that was published recently about what the U.S. pays to participate. There is the overhead to the OECD, there is the national implementation costs, and then there's the time burden, which gets calculated actually as a real cost. And so that led us, a co-author and myself, to begin to think about what it means to divulge the costs of an international assessment. And anytime you talk about the cost or the value, people ask whether it's worth it. And so there was this conversation around costs and benefits, which would be extremely challenging to do in my assessment, to actually do a full cost-benefit analysis of international assessments. So we've been having some discussions about that. In the end, what I learned is that publicly available information is not always easily accessible.
I want to ask now about what it is that got you both into this line of work.
It does relate to some of my own upbringing, Norwegian great-grandparent, homesteading great-grandparents, some German roots, and what it meant to be Americanized. But when I think of a childhood and it's how it shaped my interest in international education, my father is a scientist who has pursued international fieldwork research in much of the Southern Hemisphere. So I had early travel experiences. And my mom is a school teacher. And so I think the combination of their careers and how it shaped my early upbringing meant an interest in languages, an interest in travel, an interest in teaching. And that sort of set forth in motion an interest in studying abroad, pursuing language learning. I taught for a while. I taught Spanish and English as a second language in the Chicagoland area, a landscape that has changed dramatically in terms of flows of people, the economic shifts that have affected Chicago. And so what I was always missing in working on bilingual education, multicultural education, was this sort of broader global perspective. And so that ultimately, I think, shaped my own interests in international education. Much like most of our students, I found my intellectual home in international and comparative education. And so that's what's brought me here.
Well, I grew up in the South, the American South, which at that time was very literally black and white socially. And my grandparents had been medical missionaries in China before World War II. And so there were little Chinese things that my mother brought back lying around the house. And nothing big, but tortoiseshell boxes and that kind of thing. And that planted a seed of, there's something beyond this place in my mind. So that coupled with in high school, I grew up in the late 60s, and that was a time when schools were being challenged in a lot of ways by reformers within the U.S. And so I became very interested in education reform at that time. And so I went away to undergraduate school. There was an opportunity to study in Japan. China was closed to Americans at that time, and Japanese had the advantage of not having tones, which Chinese had. And so I took the easy route and went to Japan. When I got there, I found a place that was quite well developed economically and socially and hadn't gone through the Enlightenment, all of the things that at one time were thought to be necessary for a country to grow economically. And that was interesting to me, a parallel world in which the society had developed differently, and that was interesting. I went back, it was transformative in that sense. I went back, stayed for a while, got a master's in English, TESOL, taught.
TESOL meaning teaching of English
as a second to speakers of other
speakers
languages.
of other languages, right?
And I was there for a while, and Japan, I got a bit bored in that Japan is a wonderful place, but it's also rather peaceful, at least on the surface. And I was watching all of the social, political, economic transformations taking place around the world and thought, that looks more interesting. And so I went back to doctoral study and got involved in international education for development as a result of that. But I still retain my first love country. I think the first country one goes to leaves a deep, deep impression. And so I still have a deep affection for Japan, despite everybody's faults.
I want to ask you to wrap this up by answering one simple question, each of you. If you were stopped on the street and someone said, "What's the biggest education problem we face, and what's the most promising set of lessons we can learn from global cooperative learning?"
You asked the biggest problem facing American, let's say the American education.
Yeah, that would be good.
My response would be inequality. I don't actually think we have much to learn from other countries, but one part of my answer would be that we could learn a lot from looking at some of our local initiatives that have furthered equity of access to learning opportunities that are valuable, such as the DC Public Schools Study Abroad Initiative, which sends over 400 middle and high school students abroad every summer and has done so with a mission toward equity. And I think 4 years into the program, there have been some really powerful lessons learned about how to do work which could actually further elitism and further the gaps between different groups of students along racial and social class lines, has actually done some incredible work in shrinking those gaps. So I actually think that, and it's unique in the U.S. landscape. So that is what I would say to the person on the street.
Terrific. Very, very inspiring and very hopeful. You have another answer, Jim?
Well, another perspective would be the greatest problem. I would note inequality, and I would link it with inequality, identity, cohesion, and the common public good. Those pieces I would put together, and balancing the various dimensions there seems to me a really important thing for us to be working on. And in a sense, the investment, education, thinking of it as an investment, it's not only a human capital thing, but it's an important dimension of human capital. And if you look at our federal budget, we spend, huge amounts of money on various kinds of security, military security, homeland security, social security. We spend much less on the investment side and I think that would be what I would learn from the rest of the world is the importance of investment.
Well, this has been a real treat. Even though I've known Jim and Laura for 10 years or thereabouts, I have again learned some more new and interesting things and things that give me great hope for the future of American higher education and American education, because there are people like Jim Williams and Laura Engel who are working on this stuff. And I hope you have safe and successful continuing travels. So with that, I want to thank you both, Jim Williams and Laura Engel, for being part of EdFix today. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to our EdFix podcast on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Player FM, or wherever you might listen to podcasts. We also have a lovely website called edfixpodcast.com, and you are welcome to visit that website and learn more about what we are doing here, not just in global education, but more generally. Thank you again, Jim Williams and Laura Engel. And thanks to our great executive producer and all-purpose studio manager, Turan Waters.